In this lesson, we're going to continue building out our app and use some dynamic routing. As always, you can grab the starting code at branch L6-start. Where we left off with the last lesson, this is how our app currently looks. When we hover over one of these event cards, it becomes a bit larger, which makes it seem clickable. And that's the behavior we're going to implement in this lesson, where we click on an event card and we open up a view with the details of that event, which means we'll need a new component to display those event details, which we will soon create. The event details will look something like this, displaying the title, time, date, location, and description for that event. We're going to tackle this lesson in two parts. In part one, we're going to get this functionality to work. When a user clicks on one of the event cards, they'll be routed to the new event details component. When that component is created, it'll make an API call, fetching the data for just the event that we clicked on. We'll do that by fetching it by its ID. And once we receive the JSON response for that event, we'll set it as our local component's event data, which it can then display. So our to-do list for the first section includes the following tasks. We'll first create the event details component, then add a new API call to fetch a single event by its ID. And because we'll need a way to route to that new event details component, we're going to add it to our routes and then make all of our event cards that we're displaying in the list on our homepage clickable so that they can route to the new event details component. So we'll start off creating that new component. We'll add that .view file into our views directory. I'll paste some code here in the template so that we can display the event's details. That event object will live in our component's data. And when this component is created, we're going to fetch that event by its ID and set our local data equal to it. Before we add that new API call where we fetch that single event, I want to bring us back to our mock database. Remember, we're using my JSON server. And if we click on the events here, we can see all of the events that we have. In the last lesson, we needed to request all of these events because we're displaying all of them on our homepage in those event cards. But like I've been saying, in this lesson, we're just requesting a single event, and we can do so by targeting its ID. So if I append 123, that ID onto the end of this URL will fetch just this single event. So now that we're refreshed on how our MyJSON server is working, we can add that new API call. We'll head into our services directory and open up the event service file. I'm going to copy the get events call because the get event call is very similar. We'll delete the S, add in an ID as a parameter, and then we'll append that ID to the end of this URL. Now that our API call is written, we can start to use it. It's going to look a lot like our implementation in the event list component, so we'll copy this code and paste it into the created hook here. Of course, we're getting this red underline under event service because we haven't imported it yet, so let's do that now. And we're no longer getting events, we're getting the event and passing in the ID of the specific event we want to retrieve. For now, I'm just going to hard code the ID here in our components data. That's not the ultimate solution we're going to end up with in this lesson, but for right now, it fits our needs. Then I'll just delete the S because we're setting the value of this .event, not the events from the other component. Great, now that component is ready to use, so let's add it to our routes. So let's open up the index file of our router. We'll import our new event details component and add a route object for it. For the path, I'm just going to hard code event/123. Eventually, that 123, the ID part, is going to be dynamic. But just like we hard coded the ID in the event details component, this works for now, and we're going to change it in the second section of this lesson. Then we'll just change out the name and component to event details. So now we have our new event details route, but we need to be clicking somewhere to actually access it. Again, we're going to click on the event cards and then pull up the event details. As a refresher, if we look in app.view, remember we're using these router links to route to the root event list and about routes respectively. So we'll copy this router link and head into our components directory and paste it into the event card so that it wraps all of our code here. Inside this to attribute, I'm going to add that hard-coded path for now, event/123. Checking this out in the browser, when we click on this event card, we're routed to the event details component, which has successfully fetched and displayed that component's specific details. So with that, we've concluded section 1 of this lesson. We're now ready to move on to the second section where we make this routing dynamic. Because as we see, when we try to click on one of these other event cards, we're still pulling up the cat adoption day, and the ID at the end of this URL is still 123. Again, that's because we hard-coded that ID onto the end of this path here. We had also hard-coded it into the data of our event details component, which means that no matter which event card we click, we're always fetching just the event with the ID of 123. Of course, that's not what we want. We want to be able to click on any event card and pull up that event's details. So this portion of our route's path needs to be dynamic. We really need something like a variable or parameter on the end of this path that can be updated. And for the ultimate solution, we want to be able to feed that dynamic segment into our event details component as a prop. In order to get all this to work, this is what our to-do list entails. First, we'll add a dynamic segment to the event details route. Then we'll add the event ID to the router's parameters. Then we'll give event details access to the parameters as a prop. And then we're going to do some cleanup of our code. So first up, in order to add a dynamic segment onto our path, we'll use the colon and then say ID. You can think of this like a placeholder that gets updated with the actual event's ID. In another use case, your dynamic segment might be :user, and that's updated with a username or user ID. While we're in this file, remember we have this name property here. So on the to attribute, instead of this hard-coded path, to make things a bit simpler, let's instead bind to an object, and in that object, we'll specify the name of the route that we want to route to. In this case, event details. I'm showing you this because not only is it simpler just to route to the name of the component and not have to worry about the dynamic segment within the path here in the to attribute, but also this is a more scalable solution. Imagine if your app had these hard-coded paths in all these different router links throughout your components, and then that path needed to change. You would have to go into every single router link, update that path, make sure you didn't mess anything up, and that just becomes a bit messy and hard to maintain. However, if you had just used these names here like we just did, all you'd have to do is change the path in the router file itself, and then all those names still point to the now updated path. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, so we have the dynamic segment on the path, and it's basically a placeholder that gets updated with the event's ID, but how do we actually give it the ID? Well, we can do that by adding the params property here and setting ID equal to event.id. Remember from a few lessons ago, we have access to all the event details already here because of this prop. So now when the user clicks on the event card, they are routed to the event details, and also that event's ID is added to the dynamic segment, that parameter on the URL. If we wanted to, we could access that ID parameter by writing something like this in our template, $route.params.id, and that would display something like this. Or to get more specific about our use case, when we're making the get event call, we could pass in this.route.params.id, effectively passing in the value of that dynamic segment. The drawback, however, of accessing the route like this is it creates a very tight coupling between the route and the component that that route loads. It's more ideal, like I mentioned earlier, to be giving the component access to that dynamic segment as a prop. And we can do that very simply. We'll just head back into our router's index file, and on the event details route, we'll say props true. So now we can send in the route params as a prop, meaning we can delete out that hard-coded ID that's in the data here, and now add that ID as a prop, which is then fed into the get event API call. Now let's go ahead and check this out in the browser. When we click on an event card, it looks like it's working. We're displaying the correct details of the event, and now that dynamic segment is being updated with the right ID. But there is a little problem here. If we pull up the console here, we see that we have an error. Cannot read property title of null. The reason we're getting this error is because event details is trying to display the title of our event, but our API call hasn't yet returned its response, so we don't have an event yet. Fortunately, this is a very quick fix. We'll just head back into the event details component and add a vif on the div here and say if we have an event, display its details, which effectively causes the component to wait until it has an event from the API before it tries to display its details. And while we're cleaning up our code here, you probably noticed those event cards look pretty ugly since we wrapped them with the router links, so we'll add a new class to fix that. We'll add the event link class, then scroll down to the styles, and paste in these rules where we change the color and remove the text decoration. Now they're looking a lot better. We can click on each of them and see the correct event details. And we solved the issue that was creating our console errors. For the sake of being consistent throughout our code, we can head into app.view and change what we're doing here in the to attribute. Instead of routing to a hard-coded path, we'll use the names of the routes instead. And that does it for this lesson. If you want to continue learning about ViewRouter's parameters or other ViewRouter related topics, we do cover more in depth in our Touring ViewRouter course. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next lesson where we learn how to deploy our app using Render. To grab this lesson's ending code, you can check out the L6-N branch.